Well, for 150 years, higher education has been an incredible source of strength for our country. And there's no group of institutions that show that better than the ones represented here. You know, our nation has done better at sending lots of young kids to college than any other.
One of the original land-grant institutions, the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, continues to deliver on the promise made by the Morrill Act. Here's to another 150 years of land-grant success.
So give 3 cheers for the land-grant tradition as we celebrate 150 years of its enduring mission. Yeah!
The Morrill Land Grant Act gave me and millions of other students the opportunity to pursue and create the educational experience that we wanted, to give us a better chance to be prepared to mold the future.
And today, we all understand that education is the only viable economic strategy for America in a globally competitive economy. A strong military is about defense, but higher education is about offense and about competing successfully in the global economy.
For me, a land-grant university epitomizes the truth that if you give a man a fish, you will feed him for a day. But if you teach a man to fish, he will feed himself for his lifetime.
APLU wishes to acknowledge our annual meeting sponsors and exhibitors. Please thank them for their generous financial support. Ladies and gentlemen, please rise for the presentation of the colors by the Air Force ROTC Honor Guard from Colorado State University. Welcome Colorado State University student Kara Craner, who will sing our national anthem.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Welcome, Gene D. Block, Chancellor, University of California, Los Angeles, and Chair, APLU Board of Directors.
Good evening, and welcome to APLU's 125th annual meeting. Thank you, Kara, for that beautiful rendition of our national anthem, and happy Veterans Day to all of us. This past Tuesday, millions of voters across the country went to the polls and rendered their verdict on thousands of candidates and initiatives. Many of them will have a broad and lasting impact on public higher education. We're all acutely aware of the very difficult stretch the last few years has presented as state after state has slashed their higher education budgets to the bone. But through the indispensable work of APLU, I believe that we're getting the message out about the vitally important role of public colleges and universities in our society. The 150th anniversary of the Morrill Act, celebrated last June, helped build that awareness around the country, as did the recent elections, which focused attention on educational issues and the need to invest more in education and research. But as all of you know, we've got a great deal more work to do. Having dedicated most of my career to the cause of public higher education, I firmly believe that our system of public higher education is one of the nation's greatest assets, certainly one of its greatest achievements, a remarkable network of public 2-year, 4-year, and postgraduate colleges and universities across this country. This public network enrolls roughly 15 million students, educates about 70% of college students in this country, awards about 60% of the PhDs, and conducts close to 2/3 of federally funded research. And it's imperative that we preserve this educational system for future generations. As I consider the many challenges we face in the higher education community, I think a key message to share with others is the importance of thinking long-term. Put another way, we need to escape from what I call the tyranny of short-term thinking. Too often, we're trapped by thinking about this year's budget, the coming academic year, the next election. Businesses often think as short as quarterly results. But who's thinking about the next few decades, about the next few generations? Those of us in the education field know that there's no such thing as instant education. We understand that education and research takes time to cultivate. We cannot afford to shortchange the education of our young people for a few years in order to save a little money and still expect to build a sustainable and prosperous country. The bold federal action of the Morrill Act expanded opportunity for a broad cross-section of our citizens and helped make the nation an economic superpower, a prime example of long-term thinking. If we hope to remain the land of opportunity and a model for other nations, then we need that kind of bold thinking right now. I hope that the great work we do through APLU will succeed in convincing our state and national leaders that we must preserve this wonderful network of public colleges and universities for future generations. Future generations must have the opportunity that so many of us have enjoyed, and we must escape from the tyranny of short-term thinking. Thank all of you for your commitment and your willingness to be part of this process to protect public education. And now I'd like to introduce a tremendous friend of public education, Peter McPherson. While serving on the board of directors, I've had the great pleasure of working closely with APLU President Peter McPherson, a dedicated leader who I've come to know as something of an icon. Peter has an impressively broad and diverse professional career that spans both the private and public sectors. To note just a few of the positions he's held: Special Assistant to President Gerald Ford, Deputy Secretary of the U.S. Treasury, Administrator of the U.S. Agency for International Development, President of the Michigan State University for 11 years, Chair of the Board of Directors of Dow Jones and Company, Director of Economic Policy for the Coalition Provisional Authority of Iraq, and Chairman of the Board of Overseas Private Investment Corporation. Peter recently completed chairing the Congressional Commission charged with considering ways of increasing the number of students who study abroad. And the list goes on and on. Truly an incredible career. In addition, Peter has collected quite a few honors and distinctions over the years, including U.S. Presidential Certificate of Outstanding Achievement, the Secretary of State's Distinguished Leadership Award, the Department of Treasury's Alexander Hamilton Award, the UNICEF Award for Outstanding Contributions to Child Survival, the Humanitarian of the Year Award from the American Lebanese League, and the Jewish National Fund Tree of Life Award. And now I'm sufficiently humbled, but equally grateful for the opportunity to introduce really a fantastic mentor, colleague, and friend, APLU President Peter McPherson. Thank you.
My mother would have loved to have heard that introduction. Thank you, Gene, and welcome too, of course, to this national meeting. I, with others, state our appreciation for the men and women who have served in our armed services on this day, this Veterans Day. As been said by Gene and all over this conference already, higher education faces these huge challenges. I think that the changes are going to come faster than what we would envision. I think of my time as chair of the Dow Jones Board, publisher of the Wall Street Journal, where only over about a 5-year period, the media, the newspaper business changed dramatically. I think we'll see something like that. It'll continue, the paper continues to do what it does, but so much has changed. I suspect in 5, 7, outside 10 years, most of the institutions here in some part will look very different, in some cases dramatically and broadly different. The question is, how are we going to manage and use this change to achieve the missions that, as public institutions, the public mission that we hold so dear? It's appropriate that at this meeting we'll be talking about these and other issues, that we celebrate the 150th of Morrill Act. Justin Morrill, Abe Lincoln, and others who put all this together, the Morrill Act, had a vision of expanding democracy, of broadening economic opportunity. It's a legacy that public education particularly, but all education in this country, can be so proud of. But that vision, opportunity, democracy of education, hasn't fulfilled all that it must. And that is why most every institution in this hall and many others, a total of almost 500 public 4-year universities, have in fact committed to dramatically increase the number of degrees. We've quantified it's all there so that by 2025 we will do our part in 60% of the population, the adult population, having a degree. It's ambitious, but it's what we need to do. It's consistent with that moral vision. We also know it's not just about numbers, it's about quality. We need to think about how technology and otherwise we drive the quality and the consistency of quality as we increase our numbers. Yes, we need those strong, renewed partnerships with the states, which have been frayed so much in recent years in terms of funding. I believe that as we work at these issues, in this meeting and other places, that vision that must be fulfilled, both Senator Morrill and Abe Lincoln should be uppermost in our mind. And now let me introduce Bruce Benson, who is the president of the University of Colorado, who will be introducing our next speaker. Bruce, so nice to be in your home state, and thank you for what you're doing.
Well, thank you, Peter. And I'd like to welcome everyone to Denver and to Colorado. We have a great city and a great state. I hope you enjoy yourselves. I hope you come back often and spend a lot of tourist money here and everything else. We also have major professional sports in this town and major recreational sports throughout the state. Skiing, hiking, biking, hunting, fishing, mountain climbing, you name it, we have it in Colorado. And we also have 300 days of sunshine. So it's a great place to live. It truly is wonderful, and I plan to spend the rest of my life right here. Now, we also have outstanding cultural facilities in the Denver area, and they've been pretty well funded because we have a lot of philanthropic support on these institutions. But we also passed a tax about, I think it was 1988, where 7 counties chipped in on this tax to pay for all of our culturals. And that's why we've really been able to build up our culturals and make them world-class right here in Denver, Colorado. Puts in about $40 million a year, and that is just critically important for these institutions. Now, a few brief comments on the University of Colorado. I think a lot of you probably do know that we have a 4-campus system. A lot of people think of Boulder all the time because when I was a kid 50 years ago, you know, Boulder was the campus, and we had a little bit of other student enrollment elsewhere. And I think everybody knows that we are about the lowest funded in the United States as far as state support is concerned. And we worked hard when I started going on 5 years ago, and I said, we're going to have to really knuckle down. I looked at a changing economy, and we're going to have to cut things back. We're going to have to figure out how we can be much more efficient and create additional revenue sources. So we have done all that. We've passed a lot of legislation to make our institutions much more efficient. So I'm very proud of the fact that we've been able to do all of that in this state and continue to cut things back and make things make sense so that we are really an efficient business-like operation. The faculty, without any real prodding or edicts, so many of them are teaching. I think it's over 25% are teaching more than they're required to for a small stipend. And if I look at my administrative overhead costs, we look at all of that compared to our peers, which we are measured by, and we're about 44% below there. So I'm very proud of what people have been able to do, and we've done other things to bring in revenue. It's important that we bring in revenue from every other source. We're revamping all of our fundraising operations, how we handle our research, our intellectual property, and so we are doing everything we can. Probably one of the biggest things we've done is moving in much more into international students, and I'm sure everybody else is doing the same things, and that can really keep our place going. I always like to brag about my team because the team is the chancellors, the vice presidents, the provosts. We have one outstanding team in the University of Colorado. So times are tough, but I always say, you know, you play with the cards you're dealt, and we'll deal with it, and we'll make it work. Now it's my privilege and honor to introduce my good friend, Senator Michael Bennet. He earned his BS with honors from Wesleyan and got a law degree from Yale. He went on and did some political work, we'll say, and then he went to a law firm and worked there several years before coming out to Denver and going to work in the private sector as managing director of the Anschutz Investment Company. He managed the successful restructuring of more than $3 billion in corporate debt and really was a guy that was making a lot of things happen. And then an opportunity came to him, and that was to quit that job, and I might say, Michael, leave a lot of money on the table, and become the chief of staff to the then mayor of Denver, John Hickenlooper. He stepped into that role, and that's when I really got to know him. I think I've met him once before, and I called him and I said, we've got a problem with the classified employee system here. I was president of the zoo at that time, and we've got to fix these things. And he said, what do you need? I told him what we needed. We immediately got it all restructured and put on the ballot and passed it in the ballot measure. I've been working on that with the prior administration for several years. He also got into the budget at Denver, and we've had a very, very bad budget here, and he implemented a lot of innovative reforms in city government. So I just want to thank him for all of what he did there. So then another opportunity came along, and that was being superintendent in Denver Public Schools, which was kind of a new territory for him also. And at the time, I was chairing the Denver Public Schools Foundation, so I got to work with Michael damn near on a daily basis. And he put in a lot of reforms there and cut a lot of things back. We put in performance pay for our teachers and shut down schools and restructured schools. And we shut down one high school and then reinvented it the next year and brought it back online. So Michael did a lot of great things in Denver Public Schools to really get our kids educated and create a much better environment. Enrollment had been declining, and it then started climbing, and this year's record enrollment in Denver Public Schools. Then he had a very easy first election. Ken Salazar, senator, was appointed to being Secretary of the Interior, and there were a lot of people clamoring to be appointed, going to see Governor Bill Ritter to say, you know, pick me, and he picked Michael Bennett. So that was a simple election. That was one vote. But his next election was a little tougher, and he had to work really, really hard to get elected. And it's important that people understand how hard he worked to do that and to get elected. He has served the state very well, and he believes in bipartisanism, working together, and obviously he and I are not exactly the same political persuasion, but we work well together, and he wants to get things done. He wants to balance our budgets and get things straightened out in Washington. So I would just say to Michael, keep up the great work, and thanks for being here today. So I welcome my friend, Michael Bennett.
Then he said as he was walking off, now live up to it. The pressure with Bruce Benson never stops. And I want to thank him, our great chancellor. There were 2 Democrats, I think. There might have been more than that, but 2 that I recall, that went and testified at the State Education Commission to say that we thought Bruce Benson should be the next chancellor of the University of Colorado. One was John Hickenlooper. He's now governor. One was me. And I couldn't be prouder to have done that, because Bruce has done, not just fulfilled what we thought that he would do, but in this incredibly difficult time provided extraordinary leadership to the university, and I deeply appreciate that. Chancellor Martin, Chancellor Block, and President McPherson, I want to thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I want to welcome all of you, especially Secretary Gates, in advance of his remarks. I want to congratulate the APLU on your 125th anniversary, at least for this conference, and for raising awareness about the 150th anniversary of the Morrill Act. I want to thank you all for your commitment to advancing knowledge in our country and to educating our future leaders, inventors, and researchers. And mostly, I'd like to join Bruce in welcoming you to Colorado. This is an incredible state. And if I look a little bit down in the mouth today, it's because after 6 weeks of being on recess in the state of Colorado, I get to go back to Washington, D.C. tomorrow. All summer long, we have 3 little girls. The oldest is now 13. She just turned 13, 11, and 8. And all summer long, the then 12-year-old and the 11-year-old were at each other like this. So much so that I began to refer to them as feenagers, fake teenagers. I arrived home from this recess, and they were doing it in the living room, just nagging each other, so much so that the 8th grader looked over at me, or the 8-year-old looked over at me and said, now you see what I have to put up with. And I said to her, listen, sister, let me tell you what I have to put up with on a daily basis in Washington. Last year, actually, the oldest, the one that's now a real teenager, against all of my advice, had the opportunity to go to Harry Potter World with her mother. And the 2 others were sent to Washington, D.C. to spend the week with me. I was incredibly excited. You can imagine how they felt, because they were not going to Harry Potter World. But I was excited because I'd have the opportunity to have them in Washington and see what I do on a daily basis, because they really don't know what I do 4 days a week. So the first day they were there, I made a terrible mistake, which was to force them to come to every single meeting that I had. They went on strike the rest of the week. But one of those meetings was in Harry Reid's very fancy conference room in the Capitol. The majority leader's office has tile mosaics and oil paintings and chandeliers and views of the Capitol Mall. And we were having a briefing on China. There were about 5 Democrats and 5 Republicans. We were going to take a trip to China. So the Commerce Department came over, and the State Department came over, and the CIA came over, and they were all briefing us. And 40 minutes into this meeting, Dick Durbin, who's from Illinois, nudges me in the ribs like this and points to my then 6-year-old, I guess, daughter, Anne, who was standing in the opposite corner of Harry Reid's conference room, holding up a handmade sign that said, "I am bored." B-O-A-R-D, which, as her former school superintendent, cut me to the quick. But I think little Ann Bennett really captured extremely well the feeling of people in the country about the conversation that we're having or not having in Washington, D.C. And this is a conversation that we all need to change because we face, among other things, and I don't have time today, and you guys have a much better speaker than I to talk about all the things, but among other things, very significant structural problems in this economy. Because in the last economic recovery and this economic recovery, economic growth decoupled from job growth and wage growth for the first time in the nation's history. I didn't bring my charts today because I thought I'd spare you, but the first one would have been a line that shows that our gross domestic product is today higher than it was when we went into the worst recession since the Great Depression. The next line is the productivity index, the measure of our efficiency and productivity as an economy, which has almost gone straight up since the early 90s because of our response to competition from China and India, because of our use of technology to make things more efficient, and because of the recession itself, which indeed drove the line straight up as firms tried to figure out how to get through this recession with fewer people. But at the same time, median family income has fallen for the last 20 years or so, and we've got 23 or 24 million people who are underemployed or unemployed in this economy. So the question is, in my mind, how do you realign that? How do you realign economic growth with job growth and wage growth so we can have a rising middle class and so we can find ourselves in the position of not having the worst income inequality that we've had since 1928, which is where we find ourselves today. And I think there are a lot of things we can do. We certainly can invest in our infrastructure. We certainly could create an immigration policy that actually wasn't at war with our economy and who we are as Americans. But I think the two most important things we can do is whatever it is we can do to create the most innovative ecosystem in the world, because it's businesses that are started next week and the week after that, the firms that are growing out of our universities in Colorado and across the country as we think about how to do more robust technology transfer, for example. It's those firms that are going to create jobs here in the United States and are going to create rising wages in the United States. It's the 650 bioscience firms in Colorado that pay an average salary of $71,000 that are closely associated with the work that's going on at the University of Colorado, who now have the benefit of a reauthorized Food and Drug Administration that's actually applying 21st century science to the question of how to approve breakthrough technologies and not 20th century science to those kinds of questions. It's those firms that are going to drive that innovation. I want to talk a minute about education. I'll come back to this. But in my mind, education is the other key here. You know, the worst the unemployment rate ever got in the worst recession since the Great Depression for people with a college degree in the United States of America was 4.5%. That is a pretty significant stress test of the value we place on a college degree, either because of what people have learned or, as I suspect, because of the proxy of that degree for the willingness of somebody to stick with the work that they're doing and therefore the notion that they're going to be a productive employee. But today in this country, if you're born into poverty, your chances of graduating with a college degree are roughly 9 in 100, which means that if we don't change our K-12 model of education, and if we don't make higher education more accessible than it is today, we're going to find ourselves with 91 of our young people born into poverty constrained to the margin of the democracy and the margin of the economy before we even get started on the other stuff that we need to do. This is not a partisan observation, Bruce, this is a temporal observation. When George Bush, the son, became president, we led the world in the production of college graduates. And today, just 12 or 13 years later, we are 16th in the world. Not because we did anything differently, but because the rest of the world is thinking differently about what we face. This is what I hear about when I travel a state that's a third Republican, a third Democratic, and a third independent. Not the kinds of things you're watching on the cable television at night and not the stuff that we're hearing on the Senate floor. And I want to encourage you not to accept the politics that we're seeing back there, not to accept the political vocabulary that's going on back there, because this partisan fight, this left-right fight that you're all watching and that they're reporting on television, if you listen closely, it's going to be hard for you to hear any content in the ideas in this argument. What you've really got are a bunch of special interests masquerading as two political parties that are trying together to drag the country backward. The axis we should understand that we're on is not a left-right axis. It is a future versus past axis. And in my view, the inhabitants of the past understand that very well because they're fighting extremely hard to hold on to the benefits they acquired in the tax code and in the regulatory code and in the statute books, which might have made a lot of sense in the middle of the 20th century, but may not drive job growth and wage growth in the 21st century, and may not drive investment in public education, in basic science and basic research that have been so critical to this country's history and to our legacy to this world. You need to be voices for the future, and you naturally are because of the work that you do. That's the reason you do what you do. It's all about making sure that we provide more opportunity, not less, for the people that are coming after us. And if there are days when you think it's impossible, the example that was set by a president in an even more fractured environment than we face today, when he signed the Morrill Act in 1862 to create the land-grant universities, ought to be a pretty worthy example for us. Tomorrow I'm going back, as I said earlier, and we face this fiscal cliff at the end of the year. I've spent the last 2 years working with the so-called Gang of Eight, a group of 4 Democrats and 4 Republicans, trying to figure out whether there's a bipartisan path forward. Spent 11 months with my budget staff essentially merged with that great former university president Lamar Alexander's budget staff to see whether we can create a process that will allow us to avoid this fiscal cliff. But the time has come for us to address these fiscal matters. And for the people that I represent, our inability to address them so far has become emblematic of our dysfunction. You know, it's hard to have a conversation about energy or about immigration or about education when it doesn't appear to them that we can actually get past the political games to solve this fiscal challenge that we face. And the only way we're going to solve it is in a bipartisan manner. You know, we need to be able to say to people, we materially address the problem. That means, in my mind, that we take $4 trillion out over the next 10 years in a ratio of about 2.5 times cuts to 1 part revenue. We need to be able to say that we're all in it together. That means that we need to think about reforming. We need to actually reform our entitlements while we raise revenue at the same time. And it needs to, by definition, be bipartisan, because nobody believes, at least out here, in either party's go-it-alone approach on this question around how to fix this. And I think that if we just think about the example that's been set by generations before us, if we focus not on the special interests that surround us and will always be there, but for this moment, that we really do focus on the kids and the needs of the next generation, and the reason why we have to give them some hope that they're not going to have to pay these bills that we were unable to pay, and that we were also managing to construct a politics that's actually worthy of the aspirations we have for our kids and our grandkids, and said that we are simultaneously going to figure out how to put our fiscal house in order, but make sure that we continue to create the vital investments that we've made historically in higher education, in K-12 education, in the science and research I mentioned earlier, we're going to be just fine. And the thing that you need to remember is that you don't need to accept what people say to you back there. If it sounds crazy to you, it probably is. And what I want to say is that we need your voices and your examples as we move into this political discussion, because there is no doubt in my mind that if you're present, the quality of our work is going to be dramatically improved. Thank you so much for everything you do. Thank you for coming here to Colorado, and I look forward to hearing what you come up with during the course of the discussions you have here. Bruce, thank you for inviting me. Appreciate it. Thanks.
Welcome Michael V. Martin, Chancellor, Colorado State University System.
think I'll get that recording and carry it with me. That was wonderful. Thank you very much for the chance just to say a few words. Join my friend Bruce Benson, although I'm a new member of this citizen of the state, to welcome you to Colorado. And Bruce shared with you some of the wonderful outdoor activities that I'm just beginning to experience, but I've spent the first part of my time getting acquainted with a wonderful set of wineries and some wonderful microbreweries in this state, and I hope you'll join me in enjoying them. This is a challenging time, as has already been noted, in higher education, and we are celebrating the 150th anniversary of the Morrill Act. But I would like to remind you that our legacy in building great public education facilities for the greater good goes back farther than that. Two of the founding fathers started public universities, Penn and University of Virginia. In his farewell address to the nation, George Washington mentioned the need to continue to invest in public higher education. The grandfather, I suspect, of the land-grant institution, Jonathan Baldwin Turner, who sort of invented much of what became part of the legislation, reminded us from a very small place in Illinois that we could build a great university system that could serve for decades. And of course, Justin Smith Morrill and Abraham Lincoln and those who then stood on those wonderful pillars built this great institution we call the land-grant universities. And we have a commitment, I believe, to continue to build on it. And this is a critical time for those of us who've been in APLU, even back when it was nostalgic, know that we've been through many, many challenges, and I can't think of a time in higher education when the challenges are more profound. So it's a delight to have great colleagues here to share with us their perspective. And now I'm going to get to introduce a colleague who's going to introduce our special speaker, and that colleague is President Bowen Lofton from Texas A&M, and I'll just tell you a bit of what I know about Bowen. He's a long-time academic with a wonderful background, a graduate of Texas A&M, and on to other great adventures. He also studied I think you got 2 degrees at Texas A&M and Rice University. Rice University. He went on to serve at Old Dominion in many roles. He then served as Vice President and CEO at Texas A&M at Galveston, TAMU at Galveston. In June of '09, he became the interim president at Texas A&M, and then in February became the president. He brings an enormously powerful background to what he does. He's a good colleague. And today, he is probably most well known as the head of a university that completely screwed up the BCS yesterday. And we're proud of you, Bowen. It was a wonderful turn of events. Let me introduce Bowen Lofton.
Thank you, Mike. It's ironic the BCS committee is meeting here today, by the way. I watch where I walk. It's a rare event to be able to introduce someone you once worked for. It's not that I have everything to say about his hidden life. The press has already figured it out, Bob. But having worked for him for many years, I do have a few things to offer that maybe are not found in your bio, in your program, or in Wikipedia. And Bob, I did consult your heckler-in-chief, by the way, for some ideas about this introduction. For example, Bob appreciates W.C. Fields and George Carlin. Put those two together. Interesting. He likes movies featuring John Wayne and Clint Eastwood. He loves to hike, especially in cool weather, the trails in Washington State, and still posts to this day on a popular A&M message board. But he's known around the office I occupy now for the frigid temperatures he put there. Everyone, when I walked in the office, had their own space heater because Bob kept the thermostat at 60 degrees. Much to the chagrin of Chuck Scipio, who was the person responsible for energy conservation on campus. And by the way, Sharon Raleigh took her heater with her when she retired. In a word, though, or in a phrase, Bob Gates can be described as an agent of change. As director of the CIA, where he worked for 27 years, as president of my university, Texas A&M, and his 5 years as Secretary of Defense, and by the way, the only defense secretary to serve under 2 presidents of different parties, Bob was known for shaking things up without tearing things down. At A&M, he engaged in the most ambitious faculty hiring process in the country. Over 5 years, almost 450 new faculty were hired. In defense, he worked to shift our military strategy in Iraq. He also worked to change the massive procurement programs our Pentagon is known for. Bob has never been afraid to tackle big problems with big ideas. But he also never forgot the important small things that are so crucial to the operation of our organizations. We have a tradition at Texas A&M, the week prior to classes begin, we have a day called Move-In Day, when freshmen come on campus for the first time and we help them move into the dormitories. And I, as president, do that now. Bob, as president, did it when he was president at Texas A&M as well. The very first time he did this, he immediately got an email from an irate father who said, "How dare you give me a parking ticket for unloading my daughter's clothing, computer, and so on for an hour or so during this move-in day?" And Bob said, "You know, that's right. Why are we doing this?" So he immediately not only canceled that man's ticket, but those tickets issued for everyone else that entire day, which cut the funding of parking a huge amount, by the way, at Texas A&M. But he understood the small things create impressions and attitudes that are very, very important. Bob's not only a change agent, but also a person that understands what's fundamental to an organization. Ask the wounded warrior at Walter Reed Army Hospital that saw an immediate upgrade in the conditions of the hospital after Bob made a surprise inspection, saw deplorable conditions there, and immediately fired the commanding officer of the hospital. That's how reactive he was when he saw what needed to be done. I'm a president committed to direct interaction with students, and so was Bob. I appreciate his organizational priorities and leadership style. Although he once responded when asked which job was more daunting, being director of the CIA or president of Texas A&M, he said, "Well, on the one hand, I'm responsible for hundreds of agents in dangerous places in the world. On the other hand, 45,000 students. You get it, don't you? Which one's more daunting to any of us?" All of us in higher education appreciate what Bob Gates has done during his time at Texas A&M and also before and after. Bob Gates, change agent, a leader focused on those who matter, like students and the warfighter. This is the Bob Gates that I know and I work for. Now join me in welcoming our keynote speaker this evening, the Honorable Robert Gates.
Well, thank you, Bowen, for that very kind and generous introduction. And let me just say at the outset that Texas A&M didn't play football this way when I was president. In fact, nothing caused me more stress than watching Aggie football. And I would ask my wife, I said, "I've been the director of CIA, I've done all these things. How can football cause me more stress than anything I've ever done?" And with the knowing look of somebody who's been married to somebody for more than 40 years, she said, "It's because you have no control." The issues being discussed at this conference carry a special personal resonance for me. Of course, because I once was counted among your ranks. As you know from experience in university administration, the days and duties of that job are hardly glamorous and often less than intellectually stimulating. They all too frequently consist of things like fundraising, admissions, student parking, dealing with the state legislature, keeping alumni happy, and keeping the faculty happy. Back at A&M, the faculty, and I would say especially the political science and public policy professors, rarely invited me to speak to their classes. I think the reason was that when given the opportunity, I would tell the students that world governance, real world governance, and statecraft is nothing like what their professors were teaching them. But when it came to dealing with the faculty, I knew from the outset that I could either be nice or be gone. The fate of several high-profile university presidents who failed to learn that lesson. So I decided to be nice. I ended up finding myself first responsible, as Bowen said, for 45 to 50,000 young people aged 18 to 25. And then overnight, found myself responsible for more than 2 million men and women in uniform, most of them exactly the same age. With respect to the Aggies who entered military service during my tenure, I never forgot that I was the one who signed their diplomas and handed them to them. And then as Secretary of Defense, signed their deployment orders to Iraq and Afghanistan, and then too often had to sign a condolence letter to their spouse or their parents. So on this Veterans Day, a heartfelt thanks to the many schools represented here who have welcomed our veterans home and back to school with so many awesome programs for reintegration and support of them and their families. And thanks to all of you who have served. When Pete McPherson approached me about speaking at this conference, I was more than happy to accept. The cause of public higher education in general and land-grant universities in particular has been a keen interest that preceded even my tenure at Texas A&M. I come from a family of Kansas State and KU grads, and my wife Becky's family has a similar relationship with Washington State and the University of Washington, which of course always made for spirited exchanges on Saturday afternoons and during family reunions, especially during bowl season. Today I'd like to offer some thoughts about, first, the historic importance of state-funded universities and R&D as a public investment and public good. Second, the stiff financial challenges faced by public universities, the most immediate being the possibility of sequestration. Third, some recommendations about how public universities can better cope with this challenging fiscal environment. And finally, the role of land-grant universities as representative of U.S. idealism and U.S. leadership around the world. I've always been a straight shooter, but in complete retirement and now with the elections over, I feel especially unleashed today. As a starting point, I think it is not too great a stretch to assert that the economic preeminence of this country, and I would argue our national security and international influence as well, are due in no small measure to two visionary laws, the 1862 Morrill Act and the World War II GI Bill. The first manifested a national conviction 150 years ago that our future as a nation required that higher education become easily available and affordable to the average citizen, and that teaching and research, particularly of agriculture and engineering or mechanics, were vital components of our national economic development. And the second, the decision of the nation after World War II that those who had served in uniform should also be able to go to college. And for that great generation to become so a second time in launching our post-war peacetime economy. It is due to these two seminal acts of vision and courage that I believe we have prospered through continued investment in education and research, especially in the fields of science and technology. The standard of living of Americans in the years to come will depend largely on the quality of the jobs Americans will be able to hold. And the quality of those jobs depends largely on the quality and quantity of education they'll receive. As New York Times columnist Tom Friedman wrote last week, my prediction is that the biggest domestic issue in the next 4 years will be how we respond to changes in technology, globalization, and markets that have, in a very short space of time, made the decent wage, middle-skilled job, the backbone of the middle class, increasingly obsolete. The only decent wage jobs will be high-skilled ones. The answer to that challenge, Friedman went on, will require a new level of political imagination, a combination and collaboration between business, universities, and government to change how workers are trained and empowered to keep learning. Symbolized by the Morrill Act and the GI Bill, we Americans agreed as a society a long time ago that educated citizens benefit the whole society, that the economic, political, and social benefit accrues to us all, and not just those who receive the education. That was the primary reason for the creation 150 years ago of the land-grant college system under the Morrill Act. It is why early in the 20th century, universal primary and secondary schooling was supported. It is why a system of superior state universities was created and generously supported, and scholarships were given to needy students. It's why the GI Bill was passed during World War II. Making a college education widely available to citizens at every socioeconomic level was seen broadly as a worthwhile investment in the social and economic future of our individual states and of the nation as a whole. As Friedman suggests, that investment is as crucial today as ever in our history. Higher education had and has a vital role in our national security as well. One of the key milestones was the passage of the National Defense Education Act in 1958. The bill that greatly increased the federal government's role in funding education at every level. What spurred government action was the Soviets launching of Sputnik the year before, an event that galvanized the nation to ensure that we would not fall behind in math and science. Educators were often the ones leading the charge. Some called the conflict a competition in brains. The historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr. said more colorfully that the United States must return to the acceptance of eggheads and ideas if it is to meet the Russian challenge. And indeed, the years proved him right. Throughout the Cold War, universities were vital centers of new research, often funded by the government, and also new ideas and even new fields of study, along with basic research in the hard sciences to support our country's defense and space exploration needs. Federally funded low-cost loans and fellowships made graduate school broadly available to students like me. It seems, though, today, those visionary, forward-looking statesmen, the politicians who supported higher education as a public good, a necessary public investment, are in our rearview mirror. In recent years, we've seen a gradual abandonment of the principle that higher education is a public good, and correspondingly, the emergence of a view that higher education is a private consumer good, a value primarily to the individual who receives it. This trend has manifested itself in dwindling state financial support provided for public higher education. For years, funding for state universities has been falling, tuition rising, and students are borrowing more than they receive in grants. According to the Carnegie Foundation, during the 1990s, public colleges and universities drew more than half their operating support from taxpayer sources. Today, money from state coffers provides about 30% of funding, and the story is much worse in many individual states, including right here. At some of the nation's most prominent public universities, such as the University of Virginia and the University of Colorado, State funding contributes less than 10% of university operating support. At William & Mary, where I'm proud to serve as chancellor, it's about 12 or 13%. According to an Illinois State University study, between 2011 and 2012, state aid to universities declined by about 8%, the largest such decrease in 50 years. The cuts are not a one-time phenomenon. Per student support for public universities has been reduced by more than 20% in 17 states and by more than 10% in 15. And frankly, I believe that those statistics understate the decline. We have gone from state-supported to state-assisted to state-located. And the less financial support the politicians provide, the more control they want. Earlier this year, I was struck by the fact that student loans became an issue in Congress and the presidential campaign. Controversy is over whether interest rates should be allowed to rise, and if not, how to pay for the extra cost to the government. I found it striking because when I was a college student, this matter would have been mostly a non-issue, at least for those of us attending state universities or colleges. Tuition then was either ridiculously low by today's standards or in some cases free. My out-of-state tuition at William & Mary in the fall of 1961 was $361. A disturbing aspect of this change is its consequence for low and middle-income students. College has been a traditional path of upward mobility, and this has been particularly true for students who are first in their family to attend college. Consider that until the 1960s, tuition at the University of California system was free for all state residents, and fees remained very low for some years afterward. While programs for the elderly, which now consume more than half of all federal spending, are considered politically untouchable, there is no such resistance for cutting support for higher education. To be blunt, we Americans are mortgaging the future of our country to pay benefits to my generation, while sacrificing the engines of economic and social growth for future generations. This is a formula for national decline. While the funding shortfalls at universities hit economically disadvantaged and middle-class students hardest, they also affect the ability of universities to conduct basic research, a special concern of mine as a former president of a major research university. What is discovered in the lab one day is taught in the classroom during the next, and then employed as a tool of economic development, innovation, and in some cases, national defense. And the notion that teaching in universities serves students and research in universities does not, and that the two are at cross purposes instead of fundamentally linked, integrated into one another at the core, betrays on the part of the purveyors of this view a profound misunderstanding of how universities become great and stay great, and a profound misunderstanding of the higher education enterprise as a whole. Now, it is widely acknowledged around the world that the U.S. university system, our higher education system, is the finest anywhere. But now some politicians want to screw that up too. Consider just 1 year of my tenure as president at A&M. In 2004, A&M received nearly $570 million in research funding, and $400 million of the grants were new awards. That year, our faculty submitted 121 new inventions and established 78 new royalty-bearing licensing agreements and 88 new patents. And every single one of those faculty taught. Federal funding for research and development overall has long been in decline. Between the 1970s and 1990s, it fell as a percentage of gross domestic product by more than 50% in the physical sciences and in engineering. Federal R&D funding increased slightly in recent years, but has resumed its long-term slump, just as China and South Korea are increasing their funding 10% year over year. In a knowledge economy, American jobs will depend more on scientific research than they did in the 1950s, and yet we spend much less on research today as a share of GDP. Fighting against this trend as Secretary of Defense, I tried to protect and even increase S&T funding, including basic research and at DARPA, even as the rest of the defense budget began to flatten and decline. All of these challenges facing America's public universities, and especially those with a strong basic research, science, and technology program, will come to a head at the end of this year. Without a new agreement between the Congress and the President, hundreds of billions of dollars of mindless, so-called sequestration cuts will take effect. The effect on national defense and military readiness is by now well known. The leadership of the Pentagon and the aerospace industry have made sure of that. Less well known is the impact on important domestic functions of government: Homeland Security, air traffic control, federal law enforcement, NASA, the National Institutes of Health, and related to those last two organizations, funding for basic research and development. According to the American Association for the Advancement of Science, under sequestration, federal R&D funding will be reduced by nearly $60 billion over the next 5 years. Cuts of this magnitude would have significant impacts on the pursuit of science, research, and innovation in this country. And they also come at a time when federal R&D spending has already declined by 10% in real dollars since fiscal year 2010. My expectation, admittedly more of a hope, is that now that the elections are behind us, whatever adults remain in the two political parties will make the compromises necessary to put this country's finances back in order. We will all pay the price for shortchanging education, research, and other investments in the future. It will be felt in the decline of America's quality of life, standards of living, and global influence. We are squandering 150 years of moral act enlightenment and 70 years of the greatest generation transforming small colleges into great learning and teaching institutions. So how to alter this increasingly bleak landscape? First and easiest, of course, would be to have elected leaders of the vision of 1862 and 1945. I wouldn't bet on that. So what else can we do? Such a challenging environment makes it imperative for public universities to find new ways both to contain costs and expand opportunities to more students. In short, to reform the way you do business. This is no easy task, I know. Since leaving the Pentagon, I've reflected on the similarities between the three public institutions I've been privileged to lead: CIA, the Department of Defense, and Texas A&M. All very large, very proud, tradition-bound organizations, staffed by career professionals who don't always welcome change. We need to think boldly about the delivery and financing of higher education writ large, similar to the robust debate and experimentation taking care in the healthcare arena. Both fields have seen unsustainable cost increases in recent years without corresponding improvements in outcomes. I fought similar battles as Defense Secretary, especially during my last 2 years in office when it became clear that our budget trajectory was heading downward and that maintaining military readiness would require the Pentagon to squeeze more out of every taxpayer dollar. At times, the process of finding savings in the bureaucracy felt like going on an Easter egg hunt. We found that one way to improve efficiency and reduce operating costs was through taking advantage of scale to enhance our purchasing power. Of course, when it comes to scale, you can't get any bigger than the Defense Department, the world's largest employer, consumer of energy, and purchaser of many goods and services. But with respect to public education, I suggest that universities in a given state or region consider banding together in procurement of a wide array of services, supplies, and technology, leveraging your economies of scale. Some have already moved in this direction. Another approach many are taking to cut costs is through automation and the use of online education. But a word of caution. I would only hope we don't go so overboard in the online world that we lose one of the fundamental benefits of higher education: live, in-person interaction with faculty and other students. This is especially important in an emailing, texting, tweeting, Facebooking world where students may forget how to have a real face-to-face conversation or dialogue with people of different backgrounds and views. So those are just a couple of ideas, but the main point is that we have to be as creative and as innovative in keeping costs down as in every other aspect of higher education. We also have to make higher education even more widely available and improve graduation rates. I applaud APLU's initiative to increase the number of Americans with some kind of college degree by 60% to 60% by 2025. With respect to graduation rates and the amount of time it now takes to graduate, I never understood why the federal government used a 6-year standard for financial aid eligibility. At A&M, I addressed this problem by imposing a flat tuition system. Every full-time student paid for 15 credit hours. If that student only took 12 hours, they needed to explain to their parents why they were paying for more. But if a student took more than 15 hours, the additional hours were all free. Over a couple of years under this new program, the number of semester credit hours being taken at A&M increased by tens of thousands. Finally, public universities need to continue to develop innovative partnerships with community colleges, both to improve four-year graduation rates through better preparation and to cut costs for students. In sum, if public universities and colleges don't reform themselves to contain costs and improve graduation rates, federal and state governments will step in. And like the dinosaur, government has a heavy foot, a small brain, and no fine motor skills. Believe me, I know. I'd like to conclude on a more upbeat note with some thoughts about international influence of our higher education, and particularly the contribution our universities, and particularly land-grant universities, make in combating global hunger, an area in which Peter McPherson has long experience and in which many public and land-grant universities have an opportunity to make a real difference. I should note parenthetically that food, health, and other human development issues were professional concerns of mine at CIA beyond the obvious focus of the Soviet Union. Much of the research and analysis was directed at identifying future sources of conflict and instability, with hunger and disease ranked very much near the top. We devoted considerable resources to assessing global food supplies and developing satellite technologies that could measure the production of wheat, rice, soybeans, and other crops around the world. A&M, like other large land grants, had a large and active agronomy, animal husbandry, and public health programs. Several World Food Prize recipients either graduated from A&M or taught there. We were most proud to count as one of our own the late, great Nobel laureate Norman Borlaug, whose agricultural research saved the lives of 1 billion people on this planet, according to his Nobel Prize citation. When I joined the Defense Department, I needed little convincing that humanitarian and developmental efforts were going to be even more crucial to the outcome of the defining struggles of this century, be they ideological, sectarian, or economic. We know that certain pressures, population, resource, energy, climate, economic, and environmental, could combine with rapid cultural, social, and technological change to produce new sources of deprivation, rage, and instability. Indeed, since the beginning of human history, the adequacy of food supply has determined the strength of clans, tribes, and nations. Unfortunately, in recent decades, U.S. government foreign assistance has all too often ignored the role of science, research, and human capital. I recall that some years ago, A&M joined other universities in a USAID project to help the people of Rwanda develop their coffee crop after the horrific slaughter that took place during the 1990s. A decade later, as a result of that university partnership with government, companies like Starbucks were paying top dollar for Rwandan coffee. Over the past decade, faculty members from numerous universities traveled to both Iraq and Afghanistan to help revive agriculture in those traumatized societies. Until 2000, universities were rarely, if ever, asked to help with foreign assistance programs, and even then their input was limited to the production of food and not much else. In all, land-grant and public universities are a vastly underused resource for the federal government and NGOs. Today, the majority of all foreign assistance is contracted to consulting firms within 50 miles of Washington, D.C. Some do excellent work, others less so. But the result is universities and other sources of expertise are not players in the foreign assistance programs the way for-profit contractors are, especially those with beltway connections. I tried to get the U.S. Agency for International Development to partner with APLU to take advantage of university experts, both in Afghanistan and in Iraq, but the federal government wasn't much interested. Given how much the USAID has shrunk since the end of the Cold War, universities could be invaluable in providing people who are not only expert in their fields, but accustomed to working in developing countries where living conditions and security are less than ideal. Looking ahead, we know the share of aid provided by traditional sources in Western governments will decline, and increasingly the burden and the mission will fall to the nonprofit sector, NGOs, universities, and others, working in concert with government to get the best results. Well, I've covered several disparate subjects this afternoon, but I wanted to address several challenges that you face. And if at times my usual measured, calm approach sounded somewhat strident, I plead guilty to frustration over politicians of all stripes who seemingly are incapable of doing the obvious right thing. Though our country faces some major obstacles when it comes to getting our economy, public finances, and correspondingly support of higher education back on track, we also have the means, and in the case of the universities, the brains to do so. The U.S. has overcome far worse circumstances in the past, and when forward progress comes on the challenges we face, and God knows we've waited long enough for some bipartisan leadership out of Washington, America's public and land-grant universities and colleges will have a major role to play as a driver of opportunity and prosperity at home and a vehicle for U.S. influence and idealism abroad. I want to thank APLU for this opportunity and to thank each of you for your stewardship of these great institutions. Your work every day is of enormous importance to your community, your state, and our country, not to mention the world. Thank you. We have some microphones in the aisle, and I'll try to answer your question with my usual ambiguity and circumlocutions. Or does everybody just want to get to cocktails?
Mr. Secretary, Mr. Secretary, let me thank you for everyone here for your just outstanding comments and perceptions. What do you think about the veteran benefit education programs? It looks like a very large amount of money, and some of us worry as to whether or not it's having the impact that it might. Would you want to comment about that?
Well, I have to confess that I'm a little conflicted here because as former Secretary of Defense, I feel strongly about doing whatever we can for our veterans, given what they've been through. When the Webb bill was first going through the Congress, I was concerned on a couple of counts. One was in fact where the money was going to come from. But the second was that it was made available no matter how long your service. And the benefits were so generous, I and the Joint Chiefs of Staff were concerned that we would have a retention problem, that we would have a huge outflow of young men and women who saw this gigantic pot at the end of the rainbow and leave the service when we needed them to stay for a longer period. And so I tried to get Senator Webb to agree to 5 years of service as the minimum for eligibility for the program, so we get at least 2 enlistments out of people. They refused to do that. And the only countervailing argument I could make, and where I did ultimately prevail, was to at least make that benefit available if the service member didn't want to use it, to make it available to their spouses and their children. And I think, Peter, you'd be surprised how many of the veterans, and especially those who are a little older, are actually not using it themselves and are sharing it with their children, because it's even divisible. You can give part of it to one child and part of it to another. So in that respect, I think it's very constructive, and I think that money is being very well spent. And I think as I look at the number of veterans programs in universities and colleges around the country, I'm heartened, as I said in my remarks, by what's being done to welcome them back. That said, I do worry that, first of all, some are being taken advantage of, particularly in some of the for-profit organizations. I worry that they're not quite sure what they want to do, but they get this big check if they enlist, or if they enroll in school. So I think the law is the law. And I think the key, particularly for public higher education, is to make sure that among these programs of support for the veterans are those that are also supportive of them taking a curriculum that will lead to success and lead to graduation and to a good job after they graduate. And so not only helping them adjust to college life, but doing whatever you all can to guide them in a path that is constructive and is consistent with their skills and their interests, and that leads to a positive outcome.
Hello, I'm Marcy Greenwood, and first of all, I want to thank you again for one of the best speeches I think we've had here at APLU on the value of public higher education and the impact that it has had on the country and will have in the future. So the one thing that I would like to ask you to do is to give this speech in many places other than to collections of the already persuaded, because coming from someone with your background and your great understanding of the system, both the federal government and the university system, it's going to make a lot more difference than if some of us do it. So thank you for what you've done, and thank you for inspiring us this evening, and please do make this speech widely known and used around the country.
Mr. Secretary, you mentioned two of the traditions of a land-grant university, agriculture and mechanical arts, but as you well know, particularly from Texas A&M, military science is a core of who we are as well. And we all have ROTC units at land grants, but not all are prospering as they are at Texas A&M. Have you any advice on how we can continue to build and maintain and energize ROTC units across our system so we can continue to provide balanced leadership to the military as Lincoln envisioned it should be?
Well, I think first of all, one of the challenges that all ROTC programs are going to face is that as the military shrinks, the number of slots for new officers will also probably shrink. And so figuring out how to place these young people who want to be commissioned, I think will be a challenge for both the Defense Department and for universities, and I think it's going to be important to work together. One of the things that I think people ought to look at, particularly in terms of cost sharing and the cost of these programs and sustaining them. I gave a speech while I was still secretary at Duke about 2 years ago. And the thing that impressed me at Duke was that there really was a consortium of universities in the Research Triangle in their ROTC program. It was UNC, NC State, and Duke, all three. And among the three, they had a lot of synergy and a really big, powerful program. Similarly, when Yale just reopened to ROTC, they're actually in a consortium with MIT and several other universities, not MIT, that Harvard has done that with MIT, but Yale has joined with several other universities in the New Haven and the Eastern Connecticut area in terms of offering a common curriculum and blending together. So where there are some of you who are co-located or close to other universities, and if you're feeling pressures on these programs, I think talking with your neighbors and seeing where you can share resources and work together would be one way to help contain the costs.
Mr. Secretary, I too want to thank you for an outstanding speech. My name is Sabina O'Hara, and I'm the Dean of a newly founded college at the University of the District of Columbia, College of Agriculture, Urban Sustainability, and Environmental Science. And I was particularly inspired by your remarks about the public goods character of higher education and reminding us of that public goods character that requires investment, but at the same time reaps great benefits far beyond the individual. It seems to me that there are lots of other areas too where that is the case, natural resources, environmental resources that have a similar function as public goods and that tend to be similarly neglected. It seems to me that to draw more attention to that conundrum of the public goods, it requires more than research in agriculture, in the sciences, and engineering. It requires research in the social sciences, in culture, in the humanities. I would really appreciate your comments.
Well, as a history major, I couldn't agree with you more. I used to tell the students at Texas A&M, that the freshmen, that we would have a freshman convocation, and I would tell them that When I went to William & Mary, I actually started in a pre-med program. And my first semester, my freshman year, got a D in calculus. My father called from Kansas and said, "Tell me about the D." And I said, "Dad, the D was a gift." And I've commented subsequently, God only knows how many lives have been saved by my becoming director of CIA instead of a doctor. But obviously the humanities are important. But I would say in terms of this public good argument, this is an argument you all need to make yourselves to your own constituencies. Every one of you has influence in the community in which you're located and the state in which you're located. And frankly, I believe too many people in higher education, if you will, hide your light under a basket. You need to be more open about the contribution you're making to the community, and not just in the jobs you provide, but in the human capital business, which you are producing for the community and for the state. And so it's an argument, frankly, that is more persuasive and has more impact at the local and state level than it does at the national level. Because the national level, it's just too big and it's too inchoate for somebody to figure out what to do about it. And at the federal level, the dollars are so huge that it then becomes a political argument. Whereas if you bring it down to the local and state level, they get it. And especially if you shove it down their throats.
Thank you, Bob. As you mentioned earlier, cocktails do await, so we have to bring this to a close. It's my pleasure to introduce Tony Frank, the president of Colorado State University, to adjourn us today.
The last stop between a reception and all of you. Chancellor's Block, Martin, President Spenson, Lofton, McPherson, thank you very much. Secretary Gates, thank you for a great talk. I had a chance to meet Mr. Gates before he was a secretary. We served together on a panel on deemed export control that he co-chaired with Norm Augustine. Norm rapidly re-nicknamed the Committee on Doomed Experts. And it was only, we knew it was going to be a tough committee, and a couple of weeks after our first meeting, and we were all still thinking what a great challenge this was going to be, we learned that Mr. Gates had accepted the position of Secretary of Defense and would no longer be able to serve as the co-chair of the committee. But Norm, in his typical way, brought that back to us by sending out an email that said, colleagues, lest we be confused about how daunting our task is, I would remind you that at least one of us thought it would be simpler to head the Department of Defense during a time of war. I don't believe that's why Secretary Gates took on that role, but especially on this Veterans Day, let's thank him for his service to the Department of Defense as well. So our reception will be just outside. It's jointly sponsored by our colleagues at Ohio State University, Colorado State, the APLU. At CSU, it is sponsored through our Colleges of Business Beverage Institute. Now, beverage covers a lot of territory, so in this particular case, because we're in Colorado, it won't surprise you that the most common beverage here will be beer. And I think that's fitting. Our governor, John Hickenlooper, who is an excellent governor, is started his career in business in the microbrew industry, and he's also a staunch patron of the arts, and we'll have some wonderful music out here too, an a cappella group from Colorado State University called Resonant Ramblings. I'll close with one thought. My father used to say that we're all assigned things in life appropriate to our gifts and talents. So President Benson introduced a senator, President Lofton introduced a Secretary of Defense. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you beer. Thank you.